In the 1970s, Australia needed to build community engagement with China from a very low base. And it did so with vigour, and I'd suggest with imagination. The dispatch concluded with the recommendation to create a government-funded body that would direct or support cultural, educational and scientific exchange on the precedent of the recently established Japan Foundation. And that recommendation, of course, was the catalyst for the formation of the Australia-China Council. And I see at least one former council member here among us. 4 decades on, the ACC, the Australia-China Council, remains a major contributor to cultural and educational relations. One measure of its success, perhaps, being its diminution to one of just many players in a highly developed and diversified relationship, linking people and communities of our two countries through massively intensified educational, business, research, tourism, sporting, media, you name it, and business linkages. So Australia rose to the challenges of the 1970s and did so well. The question now is whether we can rise to meet the new challenges of public diplomacy in the 21st century. Australia and China are not the two countries they were 40 years ago. China's regional influence and global reach have grown in proportion to its trade and its economy, and out of all proportion to our own. When diplomatic relations were first established, China's economy was roughly the same as Australia's in real terms. Today it's over 5 times ours and growing at a faster rate. China now accounts for over a quarter of Australia's total merchandise trade, which is to say Australia is very heavily dependent on China for merchandise trade. And in services trade accounts for more international students than any other country, and the aggregate spending of Chinese tourists who visit Australia exceeds that from every other source country. China's growth has benefited Australia enormously, as we frequently hear. Absolutely true. Australia's demographic transformation over this period is no less impressive. Australia is home to around 1 million people of Chinese descent, again from a very low base back in 1972. There are only about 8,000 people of Chinese descent in Australia at the end of the Second World War, and not many more that made their way through to Australia by the 1970s. Domestically, these changing demographics have come to be reflected in heightened levels of Chinese Australian representation, particularly on elected councils, municipal councils and state and federal governments. And historically, the lives and contributions of Chinese merchants, missionaries and labourers are increasingly recognised in Australian history, in museums, in biography. Many individuals and families are commemorated, for example, in the Australian Dictionary of Biography. The Museum of Chinese Australian History here in Melbourne does a wonderful job in supporting that commemoration. And a range of Chinese Australian firms, civic associations, churches, sporting clubs feature in a growing historical literature on the life and times of Chinese communities in colonial and Federation Australia. Still, the role of Chinese Australians as cultural and social intermediaries in building closer people-to-people ties between China and Australia remains both unexplored and, I'd suggest, unacknowledged. Chinese are welcome participants in multicultural Australia, less so in formal bilateral public diplomacy. So more could be done, I'd like to suggest, to acknowledge the role of Chinese Australians in our intensified people-to-people ties, and to engage Chinese Australians formally in the planning, the processes and the initiatives supporting contemporary public diplomacy. That's basically the case I should be arguing this evening. Let's clarify our terms. We're speaking here really of public diplomacy, not of formal diplomatic relations at a government-to-government level. Public diplomacy refers to modes of international relations beyond traditional diplomacy, involving international engagements among private organisations, communities and individuals. There's substantial literature on this subject dating back to the Tufts School in the 1960s, which established the parameters for analysis of public diplomacy as a form of diplomacy. I might quote from that earlier study. Public diplomacy encompasses dimensions of international relations beyond the traditional diplomacy, the cultivation of government by governments of public opinion in other countries, the interaction of private groups and interests in one country with those of another, the reporting of foreign affairs and its impact on policy, communication between those whose job it is to communicate, as between diplomats and foreign correspondents, and the processes of intercultural communication. On this point, insofar as it involves intercultural communication, an important aspect of public diplomacy is cultural diplomacy. I don't wish to distinguish these closely. There are other forms of public diplomacy, but we're talking here considerably about cultural diplomacy today. The global spread of social media and the growing intensity of transnational mobility have had a significant impact on thinking about cultural diplomacy in recent times. I'd just like to introduce a little bit of that thinking by framing our discussion on Australia's links with China today. In 2007, when YouTube was still in its infancy, Demos issued a pioneering report on cultural diplomacy, noting that the spread of social media was empowering citizens with the tools to influence politics from the comfort and anonymity of their own homes. The likely impact on the practices of cultural diplomacy was foreshadowed at that time. I quote, "We're moving from a world where the term was primarily concerned, that is, cultural diplomacy, with relations between elites, to one where culture is also a medium between people on a mass scale. Many-to-many cultural exchange is now very fast-moving and capable of profound effect, laterally and upwardly, to the extent that cultural diplomacy directly affects and may even direct more traditional forms of public diplomacy." The impact of this style of rapid social media diplomacy, or citizen diplomacy, was widely felt in Australia back in 2009. Some of you may recall the incident in which a number of organised Indian students felt that their community was being racially discriminated against. There was a number of attacks upon the Indian students. What actually precipitated this as a diplomatic incident was a series of social media comments and interventions. Let me just run through it. As I understand it from people who were on the ground at the time, students here got in touch with our legendary cricketer, Sachin Tendulkar, and Bollywood superstar Amitabh Bachchan to tell them about this. Tendulkar tweeted his concern, and he's got a pretty big following, and Amitabh Bachchan publicly declined an honorary degree from QUT, which he was due to be awarded here. This was then printed up by the printed media. It's only when these public figures mobilised around social media went public that the public media the formal media in India took it up. And it's only then that it actually made its way into the Australian media, rather too late. In Australia, the affair was relegated to the back or middle pages before it was discovered that a well-networked social media campaign was seriously damaging state-to-state relations between India and Australia. And then formal Australian diplomacy, not just public diplomacy, serious diplomacy, was tasked with correcting the damage. Some of you remember the enormous effort that involved for state governments, the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and for their officials. Now, this particular case of Indian students in Australia highlights the relatively new element of what we call diaspora, what I'm calling diaspora diplomacy. This is a public diplomacy approach that draws on the social, economic and cultural capital of transnational diasporas in support of the national objectives of homeland or adopted countries. Now, I don't wish to go into defining diasporas here. It may or may not include Indian students temporarily in Australia. It certainly does when they secure PR. There is a blurred line around the constitution of a diaspora. But insofar as we have a highly mobile, transnational community roaming the region, shall we say, in pursuit of education and business and other opportunities, so we have a diaspora which is actively engaged in diplomacy, diaspora diplomacy, relating to its own country and its host country. Now, here I'm particularly concerned with what we call ethnic diasporas. I should say in consular and public diplomacy, diasporas are generally classified according to their citizenship. Expat diasporas, that is to say, any Australian of any cultural background who happens to be overseas at any point in time, being an Australian citizen, is called an expat diaspora. Those whose diasporic identity is associated with heritage ties to a source country or homeland are referred to as ethnic diasporas, and it's the ethnic diasporas I'm concerned with here. Ethnic diasporas, communities living away from an historical homeland and bound by affective ties with others from that homeland, both in the country of origin and elsewhere around the globe. Now, maintaining connections among multiple countries is a feature of ethnic diasporas. Australians of Chinese heritage from Malaysia, or Indian heritage from Kenya or Fiji, may be no less active members of their ethnic Chinese communities in Brisbane or the Indian diaspora communities in Adelaide, no less so than direct migrants or descendants from China or India. So the diaspora also blurs the nationality, shall we say, of people identified as ethnically diasporic members of a particular community. What then of diaspora diplomacy? Australian public diplomacy has been receptive and at the same time responsive to the new challenges of diaspora diplomacy. In 2014, diaspora diplomacy as a term was for the first time listed among public diplomacy approaches in the Commonwealth Department's public diplomacy strategy for 2014 to 16. So for the first time we see it entered in a formal government document defining Australia's public diplomacy strategy going forward, 2014 to 16. This document referred to public diplomacy at home among Australia-based diasporas and diplomacy abroad, outreach involving Australian businesses operating overseas and Australian diasporic networks abroad. So the distinction here between public diplomacy at home and public diplomacy abroad corresponds reasonably closely to the distinction I drew earlier between ethnic diasporas, diaspora diplomacy involving people in Australia, and Australian citizens abroad. Now this has in a sense been borrowed from the United States, where a similar model of diaspora diplomacy at home and abroad has been practiced and in fact studied for quite some time. It should be noted though that American analysts constantly remind their peers that a diaspora at home approach, diaspora at home, ethnic diaspora approach, such as that adopted in the United States, embraces domestic social inclusion practices and messaging related to cultural diversity and inclusion, in addition to foreign policy messaging, in order to counter, and I quote, the marginalisation of immigrant, minority and ethnic communities in terms of societal inclusion and inclusion in the foreign policy process. So as soon as we move into diaspora diplomacy and its discussion, certainly on the United States model, we are shifting the boundaries or blurring the boundaries of what we in Australia think of as multicultural policy. That is the degree to which minorities are recognised, acknowledged, represented in wider Australian society. So domestically, the optics of diaspora diplomacy in the United States mandate equal recognition and representation of minorities on peak boards and councils of government, business and the non-profit sector across the United States, and not merely in the foreign policy process. It's on this point, I'd suggest, on the optics of culturally inclusive recognition and representation at home, that Australia faces particular challenges, and I'd like to present some evidence in support of this claim shortly. Challenges in implementing diaspora diplomacy at home were the incentives for Asian Australian inclusion in the media or on peak bodies and councils, whether it's in government, business, the non-profit sector, you name it, are generally weak. The incentives for inclusion are weak outside the explicitly multicultural sector. That is to say, Australia has set up a sort of a wall in order to handle this issue of ethnic difference or cultural diversity, which separates, in a sense, those communities from mainstream Australia, which is not the case in the United States. And this is a challenge that we'll face, it seems to be pushing forward with diaspora diplomacy. But enough of the United States. I'd like to touch on legacies now, how it is, in a sense, the path, our historical path of development in China and Australia is influencing current public diplomacy and diaspora diplomacy in particular. Australia and China are each dealing with legacy issues of their own design. In Australia's case, the legacy of white Australia. In China, a legacy of wartime strategy surrounding the role of patriotic Chinese overseas, called upon to support the ruling regime in China. Both legacies need to be acknowledged, in a sense called out, and I'd suggest challenged. So the history of Australia's blind spot in what we now call diaspora diplomacy needs to be acknowledged. At a time when Australia conducted its formal diplomatic relations with China through London, Chinese Australians were prominent in business and cultural relations with China, more so than others. One little remembered champion was the Adelaide businessman Wei Li, or Ye Suhua, who was sponsored to Sydney in 1852 from Dongguan, Guangdong, by his uncle Wei Qi, a wealthy and very powerful businessman in Sydney. Wei Li was naturalised a British subject in the colony of South Australia in 1882 and built an extensive business network that extended across South Australia, which, as you recall, included all of the Northern Territory, as we now know it, into far western New South Wales, and enjoyed working relations with leading political figures at the time, including South Australian Premier Thomas Playford and New South Wales Premier Henry Parkes. When South Australia merged with 5 other colonies to form the Commonwealth, Wei Li shifted his attention to the federal level of politics, and I should add, trade. In correspondence with the Secretary for External Affairs, Minister of Defence and Prime Minister in 1902 and 3, he drafted and submitted plans for what could have been Australia's inaugural China trade policy, setting out a systematic strategy for expanding Australian trade with China. It's worth recalling here that before World War I, Australia's trade with Asia accounted for less than 10%, and all of that was accounted for by Japan and India, pretty well. There's very, very little trade with China. Wei Li wanted to change this. He advocated the appointment of an Australian commercial agent in China to negotiate a commercial treaty between the two countries. A prolonged FTA negotiations can be traced back even longer than we might imagine. He wanted to identify trading opportunities and place Australian products in the China market. He wrote about these, his files. His letters are on file in the National Archives. The Australian government of the day took his proposal seriously, but responded that it wouldn't be able to act on his recommendations for the present at any rate, unquote. But 2 decades later, the government did launch a National Trade Commissioner service. In 1921, Australia's first designated Trade Commissioner, Edward Little, was appointed to Shanghai, just as Wei Li had suggested at the turn of the century. Another who cut a smart figure in his day was Sydney-born William Yinson Li Yuanxin. In 1903, Yinson accompanied his father to Hong Kong, where he served as confidential secretary to a strong champion of Australia-China commercial relations, Sir Boshan Weiyuk, KCMG. Yinson himself championed cricket among his Chinese friends in Hong Kong. We're talking about public diplomacy, right? Cricket's part of it. On returning to Sydney in 1911, he threw himself into community affairs, business activities, and promoted closer ties between Australia and China. And it's worth noting here that the Republic of China was founded in 1912. In that same year, to mark that occasion, Yinson Li founded the Australian Chinese Association in Sydney to provide a platform for closer engagement between Chinese and non-Chinese Australians, and close relations between Australia and China. He wrote and lectured frequently on Australia-China trade in particular. In London, he gave well-publicised lectures on the prospects of investment in Australia-China trade, this back in the 1912, 13, 14, 15. And he was close to the leading Australian investors of the day, all of them, Australian investors in China, all of them Chinese Australians. Chinese Australians were the largest foreign investors in Shanghai, of anyone on earth, in the Republic. This is little known here in Australia, little acknowledged or recognised, although it was for the first time by the Prime Minister in his recent visit. He was close to the leading Australian investors in China of the day, all of them Chinese Australians, including George Kwok Bill, founder of Wing On and Company in Sydney, who built the magnificent Wing On Emporium in Nanjing Road, Shanghai, and Ma Ying-pyo, who built the Sincere Emporium. There were 4 Chinese Australian emporiums in Shanghai. They built Nanjing Road as a modern commercial centre. Now, Prime Minister Turnbull's speech, drawing attention to these Chinese Australian contributions to business ties between the two countries before the founding of the PRC, indicates the role of Chinese Australians in people ties is starting to be recognised. So we could say too of the Australia in the Asian Century White Paper, which you may recall came out in 2012. Very few of our periodic landmark reports on Australia's future with Asia has ever mentioned the role of Asian Australians. There's a paragraph in the 320 pages which makes mention, and it's a solid mention, noting that Australians of Asian heritage present a vital resource, and I quote, for encouraging informed and up-to-date perceptions of Asian Australia and help to project more accurate perceptions of Australia into our region. That's a very interesting comment that's worth dwelling on, and it's certainly worth a recommendation worth acting upon, if we can convert it into one. But it's just a start. On representation, we appear to be going backwards. There was a time when the Australia-China Council, the country's flagship public diplomacy platform in public diplomacy with China, wouldn't convene without a council member of Chinese background on council. For the past 3 years, it's had none. This is the Australia-China Council. Similarly, the Asia Society Australia describes itself as the nation's most innovative centre for all-inclusive engagement with the Indo-Pacific in the areas of business, policy, culture and education. It's not all-inclusive. The Asia Society is exclusive. Not one of the 11 members of its governing board members appears to have an Asian background. That is to be an Asian Australian. These are the organisations which are guiding Australia's public diplomacy and set themselves up as preeminent. They are really missing out on where the action is, I would suggest. On the broader optics of diaspora diplomacy relating to representation on peak boards and councils of government, business and the non-profit sector, Australia's record is a little better. Race Discrimination Commissioner, as you know, Tim Sufomsani, has been pointing out for some years that a bamboo ceiling prevents Asian Australians from taking their share of leadership positions. While about 1 in 10 Australians have an Asian background, only 3 of the 83 secretaries and deputy secretaries of federal government departments are of Asian origin. These are Tim's own calculations. A similar shortfall is to be found in the judiciary, as we've learned here from a study of the judiciary in Victoria. And Asian Australians are underrepresented among the management ranks of business, on the boards of non-profits, in executive positions, and at leading universities. Now, for a Race Discrimination Commissioner, these low figures point to Australia's failure to realise its, shall we say, multicultural aspirations. Shame. But from a public diplomacy perspective, they represent a risk. They highlight the risk for Australia in failing to recognise and be true to itself in its dealings with countries in the region, and failing to realise the potential that our Asian Australian communities confer for strengthened business, cultural and broader people-to-people ties with the region. As noted in the white paper, there is no progress in this respect. But China also has legacy issues, and I'd like to dwell on these at some length. Management of overseas Chinese affairs has been a consistent priority in China's approach to Australia for well over a century. That is, the management of overseas Chinese Huaqiao has been one of the number 1, 2 or 3 priority of Chinese consular representation. The Qing Empire's first direct formal contact with the Australian colonies, we'll recall, in 1887, was a visit by imperial commissioners sent to inspect the conditions under which the Chinese lived and worked in Australia. That was the first formal diplomatic visit, mission to Australia.
What year was that?
1887. A second commission visited in 1906 on a similar mission. And after a Chinese consular office opened in Melbourne in 1909, the welfare and management of overseas Chinese, as they're called, Huaqiao, remained a paramount concern of the resident consul, each resident consul in succession, alongside trade. Education and cultural relations soon followed. In fact, China was decades ahead of Australia in planning for bilateral educational exchange. It's recently been discovered that between 1921 and 25, 400 student visas were issued by the Commonwealth Government at the request of the Chinese consulate in Melbourne. 400, enabling young Chinese students to study in Australia. This little and known educational initiatives was comparable in scale to the Colombo Plan, if you think about it, and well in advance of Australia's earliest initiatives. But it wasn't initiated by us. We don't remember it, but it was a very, very important moment in Australia-China people-to-people diplomacy. The nationalist government that succeeded the Beijing warlord government, as it's called, which was responsible for the student visa program, the nationalist government that succeeded it in 1928 made strong and consistent representations on behalf of Chinese Australians for 2 decades, through to 1949 when the government fell. Consul Cao Wenyan, in particular, also advised greater investment in mutual understanding of history and culture. Nobody was saying that on the Australian side. until 1972. But it was being set by the Chinese consul in Australia way back in the 1930s. In addition to government representatives, the KMT nationalists sent KMT party liaison officers, 特派员, to rally local Chinese communities in support of the governing party, in support of the nationalists back home. One of these visiting KMT party liaison officers, Yu Junxian, met and married the daughter of the Reverend John Young Wai in Sydney. And one happy result of their liaison was the birth of a son, Dr. John Yu, esteemed Australian of the Year and former chair of the Australia-China Council. Now today, China's governing Communist Party maintains this legacy of party intervention in public diplomacy, and focusing in particular on overseas Chinese affairs for the purpose of education, trade and regime security, but with an additional mission to advance China's national interests in the region and increasingly project China's bland and blameless self-image abroad. The Communist Party is highly strategic in the way it goes about this mission. I would suggest far more so than the KMT nationalists in their day who came, married and went. The organisation responsible for overseas Chinese strategy is the Communist Party's United Front Work Department, 中共中央统一战线工作部. Now the phrase United Front, 统一战线, literally United Battlefront, is a term of war in Orthodox Communist Party Chinese, originating in the 1920s when the CCP briefly formed a united military front with the KMT nationalists to wage civil war against the northern Beijing government. The communists revived the term a decade later during the war with Japan, again in war, in the second united front with the KMT nationalists to fight the Japanese. The party's United Front Work Department was set up in the war in 1942 to harness friendly elites within China and among overseas Chinese to serve the Communist Party cause and not the nationalist one, I should add. But after the defeat of Japan, the department was not disbanded. The United Front Work Department ran clandestine operations during the Civil War to overthrow the nationalists, quite successfully. And to this day, the department has not been disbanded, nor has the term United Battlefront been set aside. In effect, in handling relations with Chinese overseas, the party has a legacy of considering itself as acting on a wartime footing. And I think this has implications for the kinds of strategy the party implements. At war with whom exactly? The formal tasks assigned to the United Front Work Department read, this is from their website, to protect the proper and legitimate rights of overseas Chinese, unify overseas Chinese on a broad front, enhance friendship with overseas Chinese citizens of other nations, and struggle for the rejuvenation of the Zhonghua nation, for the reunification of the motherland, and for developing unity and friendship and cooperative exchange with people of all countries. Unquote. It follows then that the party is still on a wartime footing with all those who oppose the recovery of Taiwan, for example, which is the reunification code, or who stand in the way of the rejuvenation of the Zhonghua nation, whatever that might mean. But at the moment it appears to mean extensive territorial claims over the South China Sea. The party frames its overseas Chinese policy with these strategic targets and implied enemies in mind. The command structure for overseas Chinese affairs reflects the old style of wartime command operations. The United Front Work Department takes precedence over the Foreign Ministry and all other line ministries in overseas Chinese affairs in consular offices. So Chinese overseas affairs are not even listed among the 19 responsibilities of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. It's not foreign affairs, it's business. In fact, overseas Chinese affairs are formally managed at one of the highest levels of state through the Overseas Chinese Affairs Office of the State Council, which adopts an all-of-government approach and the ultimate direction of the party's United Front Work Department and its own third department within that department. Embassy and consular attaches from different government agencies, line ministries and so on, based overseas, each work to this common strategic plan of Chinese diaspora diplomacy, formulated within central party headquarters in the support of the party's strategic objectives and State Council directions. That's a legacy. That's a legacy that goes back to war, and little has changed. Now, historically, the management of overseas Chinese affairs on a wartime footing perhaps made sense, certainly in the war against Japan. Quite possibly, while the KMT nationalists were determined to invade the mainland. But today it risks damaging mutually respectful ties between Australia and China at the people-to-people level, I would suggest. From the 50s until recent times, political competition between the communist government of the mainland and the nationalists on Taiwan drove their respective efforts to win the hearts and minds of Chinese overseas everywhere. So these little battles were being played out in propaganda bureaus and between restaurants in cities around the world, including here in Melbourne. Both parties were not at war, but certainly on a war footing. But political competition between Beijing and Taipei for the loyalty of the diaspora has abated in the 21st century as the nationalists no longer associate loyalty to themselves with loyalty to China under Taiwan's multi-party liberal democracy. And yet mainland officials have not retreated from their core assumption that regime loyalty, that is loyalty towards the Communist Party, and support for its particular strategic objectives is a necessary indicator of patriotic loyalty among Chinese overseas. Securing the loyalty of Chinese Australians to the values, aims, objectives, policies, conduct, mission, leadership of the Chinese Communist Party is the overriding goal of China's diaspora diplomacy program in Australia. It's not actually about friendly people-to-people ties in the normal sense of public diplomacy. Now, most often, to be sure, this involves building links with community networks, participation in national and civic festivals, support for a wide range of innocuous cultural activities, all to be commended. But it can also entail mobilising opposition to perceived enemies of the party, including human rights campaigners, democracy activists, constitutional reformers, filmmakers, artists, and media personalities in the diaspora, editors of newspapers and so on, who present no existential threat to China at all, but as activities unsettle the Communist Party of China. It also involves taking control of Chinese community newspapers, radio, and other media in Australia and elsewhere, and enticing mainstream Australian media to limit or remove any Chinese language offerings that might offend the party. And as I've argued elsewhere, I believe they've succeeded in the case of ABC International, whatever ABC International may have intended. Then, how do we meet the challenges given these legacies? Given the critical importance of establishing friendly relations between China and Australia at this critical time, what's to be done? In conclusion, I'd say that China and Australia each have legacy issues. Each needs to deal with them in its own way. Put simply, Australia could perhaps be a little bit more strategic, China a little less. But I wouldn't presume to tell China how to manage its own affairs. As an Australian, though, I think there's much that can be done here. In some measure, Australia's reluctance to acknowledge and to act upon its cultural diversity in public diplomacy in the region is based on our lack of familiarity with the issues and with the people involved. To remedy the analytical gaps and the data deficits on our Asian diaspora connections, and not just Chinese diaspora connections, the Australian Council of Learned Academies has commissioned the Australian Academy of Humanities, for which I'm honoured to serve, to work with other national academies to produce a series of reports on the role of Asian Australians today in business, culture, education and research linkages with their countries of origin. The first of these reports, these are issued by the Australian Council of Learned Academies, and they're all up on the website if you wish to consult the ACOLA website. The first of these reports, Smart Engagement with Asia, is the first, I think, major review of Australia's relations with Asia, which gives prominence to the role of Asian Australians. It was led by Professor Ian Ang of UTS and focused particularly on linguistic research, education and cultural linkages. Launched by Chief Scientist Ian Chubb in June last year, the report provides ample evidence that skilled migration is having a game-changing impact on the nature and intensity of Australia's relations with countries and societies in the region. Indian Australian and Chinese Australians in particular, Indian Australians and Chinese Australians, are helping to integrate Australia with the economies, societies and cultures of the region in ways that were barely imaginable in 1972. A further report on Asian business diasporas, entitled Australia's Diaspora Advantage, will be launched in May this year, and supporting these two overarching reports are a number of commissioned sub-reports on the role of Asian Australians in science, technology and research linkages, the role of Asian Australians in cultural diplomacy with their countries of origin. These are all available for downloading on the Ecola website. These research reports, that's probably fine, are all based on the proposition that the depth of Australia's linguistic and intercultural competence will be a determining factor in our successful regional engagement in innovation, in science and technology, in research capacity, in people-to-people cultural ties, in trade relations, and in economic competitiveness. In the medium to long term, the Asia-Pacific region will present major challenges and opportunities, economically, socially, and culturally, for Australia's prosperity and security. Asian Australians need to be acknowledged as a very important part of Australia's effort to meet these challenges and to take advantage of the knowledge. And we need to take advantage of the knowledge and the linkages that they offer as Australians, including their ample linguistic and intercultural competence. Australian governments and communities are beginning to do justice to the contribution of Chinese Australians to the bilateral relationship. Looking forward, greater recognition of the role of Chinese Australians would appear to be prudent, particularly in light of Australia's changing demographic profile and the evolving power relationship between Australia and China since relations were established. The task presents itself even more urgently when an increasingly powerful and assertive China recognises the advantages conferred by Chinese overseas on its own strategic thinking and strategically deploys its diaspora ties to extend its influence in Australia through public diplomacy, specifically targeting Chinese Australian communities in their own languages, which nobody else is reading, I should add. In the absence of an Australian national strategy to engage with Australia's own Chinese communities, vital and growing as they are, the voice of the Chinese Australian community, even the shape of broader Australian community life, runs a risk of being shaped by national strategies drafted in Beijing, not here. Criticisms and questions welcome.